Well, I'd be remiss if we didn't discuss the Offside, the Harold Ballard Story documentary that's coming out on CBC Gem on January 22nd. I got an advance copy. I absolutely love the hell out of it. I finished it last night.
Thank you,
Uh,
sir.
as you mentioned, I'm of a bit of a younger generation and on the West Coast, so we only really got the legend of Harold Ballard. Unless I'm going down a Wikipedia or YouTube wormhole, I'm not really getting the whole story or getting, the legacy he had, the positive and or the negative, and now after this documentary, the odd positive impact he
Yeah.
had on the region. I'm just really curious, what was the inspiration behind putting this film together?
Well, thanks, Ryan. Michael Geddes was one of the executive producers with me and Jason Priestley. And a few years ago, I don't recall what I was working on with Michael, but he said to me, he said, nobody's ever done anything on Ballard. And I couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. And so we did a little bit of digging and got a lot of interest from a lot of different people. And it's first documentary I've ever done.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a sitcom writer, but it never occurred to me to do a documentary because documentaries are generally fairly straight ahead and compelling, interesting, and everything else. But Ballard was such a clown that, and I knew growing up in Guelph, Ontario, an hour west of Toronto, growing up with Ballard on the front page every day, I was like, I cannot believe that the Steinbrenner, basically the George Steinbrenner of hockey, has never been properly, discussed. And so Michael and Jason and I sat down with, as you know from watching the documentary, a lot of old Leafs, a lot of executives, and got a lot of different perspectives on Ballard. Some, as you say, not surprisingly negative, but some surprisingly positive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that stood out, not to throw too many spoilers, but surprisingly positive was Tiger Williams in the doc, where he's
Yeah.
running him down essentially, and then kind of has a realization mid speech that, oh, this guy was like a grandpa. I loved him. Like I couldn't believe that earnest moment you had with Tiger. Were people hesitant to speak on Harold Ballard?
I don't think people were hesitant to speak. We reached out to Dave Keon.
Mm-hmm.
And Dave Keon, I don't know if we got Dave Keon or Dave Keon's people, but he had no interest. And that one was one where I think, and this is a bit of conjecture, I don't think Dave would have had anything, I dare say, good to say about Harold Ballard. I don't think he was interested in revisiting that because he had a very bad time with him. But I mean, when you think of the fact that Lanny McDonald and Daryl Sittler both had pretty rough experiences with Ballard,
Yeah.
and they were both happy to be very candid and very even-handed and very sensible. I wouldn't say anybody was reluctant. What was interesting is a lot of the people involved are no longer with us,
Yeah.
So we did rely on some of the old guard that are still around, and then the players, and all the players came in and looked like they could still play. I mean, it was kind of cool, and it was kind of cool. Like Wendell Clark drove down from Sudbury, all the way from Sudbury for the interview.
Most Canadian sentence ever said.
That's right. Did you? But Wendell Clark drove down from Sudbury, and he came in and he said, I think I just ran out of gas. Like, I think like the last 100 yards, he was out of gas. So I have photos, if anybody wants them. I do have photos after the interview of Wendell with a gas tank out in the street in Toronto, filling up the old pickup truck. But everybody, I think, was happy to be on the record. And guys like Jim McKenney, of course, if you recall McKenney from the 70s, he was a classic storyteller, and he was happy to sit down with us and tell some tales.
I not well versed in the in all of the Leafs broadcasters and personnel, so he was a delightful treat. He was a bit of a dark horse of this doc. I loved listening to him speak. What interview kind of gave you the most and kind of gave you the best? Because these are hockey players. They are kind of ingrained to be a little quieter than most.
Yeah, I think, boy, they were all interesting. Daryl Sittler just told his tale.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that he was the captain of the team, and that meant he felt he had a responsibility to the team and to his teammates. I know he had a responsibility to the ownership, and I think he was a very respectful guy. But he just sort of laid out the fact that he was he just would not complain. But he said, I don't think I was really dealt a proper hand during the Ballard regime. And the fact of the matter is, as people recall, he had a no-trade contract. But as the captain, he was the guy who had to go to Ballard and say, this coach, stop firing coaches. Like, you're firing coaches, it was okay. The guy you fired on Tuesday, I can live with, but the guy you fired on Thursday, we should have given him a better chance, But because it was no trade contract, Ballard was frustrated enough to trade his best friend, Lanny McDonald. So to spite Darryl Sittler, Harold Ballard traded a future Hall of Famer. And Sittler was very candid. Also, Rick Vive openly, I think from the documentary, you can see he first Leaf to score 50 goals 3 consecutive seasons, and Ballard would not pay him what he was worth. And
he looked like he was seething through a lot of his comments, like gritting his teeth, like
he's extraordinarily pleasant, articulate, fun guy to be with. But you're right, mentioning Ballard got his back up a little bit, and and justifiably so. I mean, the guy was not well treated. And to your point, if somebody like Tiger Williams thinks he was well treated, he's going to have good stories. If someone like Darryl or Rick Vive realized at the time and now that they were mistreated by Ballard, and by a lot of times by Punch Imlach, the fairly obnoxious general manager who was there, as you recall, in the 60s when they won the Cups. And when Ballard brought him back after his tenure in Buffalo, the game had passed Punch Imlach by. He went from like tyrannical mastermind to just tyrant.
I absolutely loved it. There's a sequence where you're showing him in the Stanley Cup parade, and he looks like a normal middle-aged older dude, and then he's at that practice and all the guys are waving in the background of the practice, and he looks like he's aged 30 years in a decade.
Well, this is a guy who did have multiple heart situations, right?
Oh, of course.
Like heart attacks and bypasses. And as far as stress is concerned, the story that goes, he had a bypass, I believe, and read in the paper in recovery that he might be out as the general manager of the Leafs in the second tenure. So he got out of the hospital apparently and drove over to Maple Leaf Gardens and to discover his parking spot was missing. And but Gord Stellick was the young Leafs executive at the time who came out, and apparently Punch said something like, "Hey, have I been fired?" And Gord said, "I'm not sure, but I've been told if you come by every week, I can give you your mail." So it was kind of a circus,
Bit of a circus. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Harold Ballard is, the stories and the information you hear about him are almost like that of legend, and kind of grow and with more and more mystique, and like the famous story of him selling 2 Beatles shows without a contract. I kind of got the sense that everybody interviewed wasn't sure what was true and what was.
Well, I think what was true, the Beatles did indeed show up with their Brian Epstein, their manager, and Ballard said, "You're doing
playing too."
And Epstein was like, "That's not in the contract." And Ballard said, "There's going to be a riot. I sold tickets to do. I'm afraid my hands are tied." Your hands are tied. Your hands are tied because you sold tickets to 2 concerts. So that, I believe, is true. The Ballard turned off the water taps, to the water fountain, and turned on the heat or turned off the air conditioning. I think speaking to Gord Stellick, he said, first of all, if you find a water fountain in Maple Leaf Gardens, tell me. And secondly, what's the deal with turning off the air conditioning in a hockey rink? That did not happen. It's just, so there was a bit of exaggeration with regard to that story. But the Beatles did play shows at, I guess, 7 and 10, which is crazy. Could you imagine, like if U2 shows up at the Chicago United Center now, you boys are playing at 5 and 9, it's but different time, very different time.
Well, luckily the Beatles only played 25 minutes and then ran into their armored car, right?
Yes, they did. And you couldn't hear what they were, singing anyway because of the screaming. But A lot of fun, and that was the same era when Ballard let Muhammad Ali fight Chuvalo, and nobody else would let Ali fight because he was considered a draft dodger. But Ballard, I think, dollar signs. So I mean, he would have put anybody. He put in the Billy Graham religious revivals. He put in wrestling. He put in anything to fill seats. And one of the interesting things was he thought, how can I make money from an empty seat? And people would say, well, you can't make money from an empty seat. He said, yes, I can. Yes, I can. I'm going to get at advertising. And so at Maple Leaf Gardens for years, when a seat was empty, it was flipped up and it says Schick Razors. There was a logo there. So he really, every possible way to generate revenue, Harold Ballard was right on top of it.
The film, like, kind of, I would say it humanizes him, based on the information, based on the lore and the history and the stories, and then based on, the stories that you gathered and the footage you've accumulated making this. Was it a goal to humanize him?
It wasn't a goal to humanize him. I think what we discovered before the fact, even, but in talking to people, was that he was, I dare say, a kind of a lonely soul.
Yeah.
And he had his wife Dorothy until she died of cancer in the 60s. But then he immediately had Stafford Smythe, Conn Smythe, the team owner's son, at his side until he died. Then he immediately had King Clancy by his side until he died. Then he had Yolanda McMillan, the late stage girlfriend. And if this documentary does humanize him, that's not the worst thing in the world. I will say, though, that as a guy who had a pretty good knowledge of Ballard before the fact, because he was on the front page of the newspaper every single day when I was a kid. And at that time, I might have been a little bit too young to understand that this guy was single-handedly wrecking the team. But my father, for example, was born in 1927, and he knew when the Leafs were good. They had a bunch of cups, and they were good. And he sort of would say, yeah, Ballard's the problem. That whole generation would say Ballard's the problem. And I guess this is a long way of saying, I don't want to humanize Ballard, although we did, too much, in that he was so greedy and so selfish that he didn't think of the Maple Leafs as a public trust, which they're not, but they were the other huge, massive Canadian hockey franchise. And while Montreal kept winning, Ballard was so greedy, he fired coaches and dumped players, and the team went right in the crapper. Yeah. And so, it was he's a guy who gave money very, very quietly to, forgive me for 1 second. I'm going to turn that off. That's my brother calling from Vancouver.
Whoa.
Maybe he wants to talk about last night's game with the Tampa Bay and the Canucks.
Get him on the horn.
Get him out there. Let's talk. He knows Ballard. My brother was the one that we were sitting in the very back row at Maple Leaf Gardens years ago during the Ballard era. We were like 20 or 50 or something. And these tickets cost us a lot of money, but we were literally in the last row so we could stand up and lean against the wall. And he said, that hockey action that is like light from the sun. We're seeing action that occurred 8 minutes ago. That's how far we are. That's how far we are. And those are the days where you'd go to an early season Leafs game during Ballard. If you ordered a hot dog, it's October, the buns were concrete. They were last year's buns. And so I'm sure they had a warehouse full of last year's buns, and then they trot them out. So the rule was no hot dogs the first couple of Leafs games, because you're watching a terrible hocky team and you're having dental damage. So
yeah, that thing's going to sit in your stomach like a brick for a little bit too long.
Yeah.
What are the Leafs thoughts on the Maple Leafs organization thoughts on the project and the film?
They were very happy. We Michael Geddes spent time with Brendan Shanahan, the president of the Leafs, and I mean I think they're fine with it. We know the Leafs are a proud, successful organization, but we're allowed to look at a time in their history when they were not a proud, good organization. This was Ballard connected the old era of very good Leafs teams to the current era of very good Leafs teams, and the fact that it wasn't instantaneous, but the fact that, within minutes of Ballard's demise, the Leafs started to get better, it was no secret that, of course, the last couple of years of his life, he died in 1990, but they were in the semifinals by 93
Yeah.
against I forget who they played. They wound up playing the Leafs. That was the team that beat Gretzky beat to go on to play against the Habs. Yeah.
And in 94, they lost to the Canucks in the West Final.
Yes.
So they were a good team in those back then.
Hockey team. And then, of course, as you recall, in 94, Vancouver went on to win. Oh, no, wait a minute.
Listen, we're having a tough decade here. We have our own concerns with meddling ownership or penny pinching ownership or questionable decisions or in the Aquilinis, and I'm seeing it throughout the doc. I'm like, well, that's not like that here, or it's not that bad, or
well, I think back then with Ballard, it was so visceral, it was so of the moment.
Yeah.
He lived in Maple Leaf Gardens. The man moved in, and you'd see him wandering around in his bathrobe, yelling at people and firing people. And it was just a time. It was so dysfunctional. It was such a circus. And we felt his story had to be told, and we're glad that we had so many people willing to help tell it.
I absolutely loved I was writing my notes down while I watched it about what I wanted to ask you, and I'm like, where's the footage of his weird apartment? And about 2 minutes later, I'm like, oh, never mind. There it is. I was so glad to see it. I was so curious about, just the idea of like, I think the owner of the Colorado Avalanche and the Denver Nuggets has like a suite or a penthouse at the Ball Arena or whatever it's called. So I'm always fascinated by the eccentric owner living in the building. So that tickled it.
I'm with you all the way. I couldn't believe when we got the footage. The place looked like a little shithole. I mean, I think there's one window. This guy owns a team. He's worth many, many millions. It's a little labyrinthine thing to a back room full of crap. And I don't know if it's visible in the documentary, but he had for reasons unknown, he had a picture of Karl Marx, which makes no sense. He had pardon me, he had piranhas. I guess his kids gave him piranhas.
Of course he did.
But very shortly after the kids gave him piranhas, one piranha ate the other. And he was like, I guess that's what happened with piranhas. And he had a picture of his deceased wife in there. What a weird place and he had a lovely house by all accounts, and he had all kinds of money. I think he felt very safe in that place. That was his little kingdom, and he felt very safe. So why not move in and just roam around? Because at that time, for those of you out there that aren't that familiar with the Ballard area, he had a bunker. He had a bunker down in the corner of Maple Leaf Gardens where he would watch the game.
The worst sight lines you could possibly have.
The worst sight lines. And what would happen back in the day is if the Leafs were getting drubbed, he's gone. Like you look at the bunker and there's nobody there by the end of the second period. 9-0 for the Minnesota North Stars. Ballard's upstairs eating ice cream in his pajamas. But I said once, I recall as a kid saying, "Can I go talk to Mr. Ballard?"
Yeah.
Because could I walk? Because I was down in the good seats. I have no idea how I got there. I must have parachuted down from the top of the arena or something. And people, the usherettes down there, they had lovely female ushers there. It was interesting. Maple Leaf Gardens. The ushers in the cheap seats were chain smoking guys who were 100.
Yeah.
These guys, they came with the building. The better the seats were, the more attractive the ushers were.
It's the damnedest thing.
Isn't that wild how I'd be sitting up in the top of this building eating a concrete hot dog with Methuselah wearing a hat beside me, guiding people to their seats, But I never talked to Ballard, but I did see that he would welcome people who would, if the game was going well, he would welcome people and shake hands and say hi.
One of my last questions before we wrap up. Don Cherry is predominantly featured in the film, and he's kind of had his fall from grace. I thought he provided a fair and accurate insight into it, and he provided something that was unique. Was there any hesitations to include him or not include him in the doc?
I don't. It's an interesting question. Don is of a different era.
Mm-hmm.
And Don, I think to your point, identifies with Ballard. He identifies with that Neanderthal sensibility. So I think, as antiquated as his thinking might be, having him in the documentary was a nice representation of that sensibility.
Yeah.
The sensibility was so insensitive and so politically incorrect that, as you say, Don has been sort of canceled for good reason. But I don't think we hesitated. We really, in this documentary, tried to show all sides for all people. And as you saw in the documentary, we talked to people in their 20s and 30s, journalists of today, who upon looking at footage of Ballard said, "Oh my God, this guy would have lasted 4 minutes." I mean, he's totally his mind is thousands of years old, and his behavior was completely unacceptable. But it was, as I sometimes tell people, Ballard was and he was the biggest patriot. He had Team Canada practicing there for the Soviet series. He wouldn't let the commies in for this, and he always this. But he acted like, and and I say this with love, he acted more like he was American. And Canadians, he acted more like a Steinbrenner, like a Trump, a selfish, short-sighted, greedy guy. And it's a sensibility that mercifully doesn't exist anymore, except, of course, I live in the United States.
I live in Florida.
Yeah. Well, I'm in Florida right now, but I'm all over the place. And I say that with love, but Canadians didn't know what to do. They did not know what to do with this buffoon, this clown, back in 1970, 1980.
Once again, I absolutely loved the documentary. It was something once I heard that this documentary was being made, I'm like, this is everything I've wanted as somebody who's fascinated by the Ballard era and tracking down whatever I can, and just hearing all these tales. So I absolutely loved it. It comes out on January 22nd on CBC Gem.
It's on CBC Network on the 22nd, and then afterwards it'll be on Gem.
Oh, then
so you can watch it on your television machine over the airwaves on the 22nd at 8:00 on CBC.
As somebody who still has Boomer cable, I'll make sure to tune in.
What I'm talking about.
I was going through your IMDb just as we wrap up. I just want to thank you because you were a producer on How I Met Your Mother.
Oh, yes, yeah.
So I would like to thank you on behalf of British Columbians and Vancouver Canucks fans for incredibly accurate Canuck references throughout the show.
Well, you're very kind. Remember, Kobe Smulders is from Victoria,
which is from Vancouver.
Yeah, she her folks live in Victoria now.
Oh, yeah.
She's in Vancouver. And I guess Carter Bays and Craig Thomas went to her early on the show and said, "You're Canadian, so why not? Can we make your character Canadian?" And she said, "Well, sure. I mean, to what end? Well, we can talk about cultural differences and some of the nuances between the United States and Canada." And I guess Kobe, she told me the story. Sure, why not? She said it was about 1 hour later. We were making jokes about Canadians being afraid of the dark and drinking their own urine or whatever it was. And people would say to me, "Will this offend Canadians?" All these references to Harvey's and a white spot or whatever it was. And I remember thinking, as a Canadian, I don't think it'll be offensive. I think maybe it'll be kind of fun and be for these esoteric little Easter eggs, these things. But I will say this: one of my proudest moments was I actually revealed the mother in How I Met Your Mother, because I was up at the office writing, and they called me on the stage, and I thought, oh, they're going to call me on the stage. They need some quality comedy from old Chuck. No, they needed me to literally go on camera because I'm a big guy.
Yeah.
And in front of the actress, Kristen Milioti, and then action, I moved out of the way to reveal her. So I was there on stage because I look like Lurch, and I revealed the mother. But and you can't even see me. I'm shot from like the chest down. But that was a proud moment. I was always delighted with the Canadian references in How I Met Your Mother, and I was thrilled that Canada. Thank you very much, my friend, for getting a kick out of the references.
Well, Robin Sparkles was a Halloween costume all across this country for many years. Like, I think they were all well received because you had a character as strong as Colby to like stand up for
Yeah.
those Canadian things. Like it wasn't like let's dump on Canada for 30 minutes. It was like no. Like, hey, shut up. It's cool.
Yeah, exactly.
But the one thing that stood out was, and well, I won't talk your ear off about a show from 10 years ago, but there's the episode where they're talking about ways to rile up Colby and like get her angry. And it was one of the things they write on the chalkboard or the whiteboard was like the 2004 Vancouver Canucks, what was it called? Northwest Division title. And then she says the diminishing play of Trevor Linden and bad acquisitions. And I'm like, shit. Yeah, that's all right. And they didn't replace Todd Bertuzzi, who got suspended at the trade deadline or right before the deadline. So it was accurate as hell. And I think a lot of Canucks fans and a lot of Canadians just absolutely enjoyed that about that show.
Well, thank you. I got to meet everybody from Luc Robitaille to Geddy Lee to Alex Trebek. Like when we were to Katie Lang when we were doing this series, and the Canadiana, Carter and Craig, who are the greatest guys in the world, they just said, "Oh, let's go all in on Canada. We're gonna have a good time with Canada." And my elder son Trevor is actually in the episode with it's the big reveal at the hockey rink, where there's an enormous Canadian. It's I forget the name of the episode.
Mm-hmm.
You'll get some message. I think it might be an episode that I wrote, where Ted is dressed like Liberace skating around. I forget what. We had a lot of body doubles and a lot of fun that day.
Playing the organ at Madison Square Garden or something.
Something like that. It was something like that, but very Canadian episode, and I got to spend a lot of time on that ice. And Video Village, where we watched the monitors, and the set, it had to be off the ice.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the set was on the ice, and I had my hockey skates. So I was the messenger between, we need you to stand 6 inches to the left. And I'd skate over and tell somebody, to Jason Siegel, move a little, or whoever was there. And then I'd skate back and forth. I had a nice workout that day. But,
I absolutely love that one of the Canadians on set, go home and get your skates. That's a cliche. That's a stereotype. I don't have that. I mean, I do, but maybe they're not sharp. Shit, they are sharp.
Yes, they
They're
are
ready
sharp.
to go.
Yes. Well, I would skate over there and skate back, and people would say show off, and I go, show off? All I did was skate, I mean, anyone who's played hockey with me knows that when I skate, it's not pretty. It's you ain't watching Trevor Linden, but
a lot of wasted movement.
Yeah. Well, I'll say, by the way, I worked on another show called Arrested Development.
Yes, you did.
And Will Arnett, I met him, I didn't know Will. And I said, I'm a kind of a hockey fan. You're from Toronto. He said, yeah, you're a hockey fan? I said, yeah. You know what the 5-hole is? I said, of course I know what the 5-hole is. And we had a nice time. That was the name of his production company.
Oh, and really? That's awesome.
That's a hockey fan. When you name it 5-hole Productions, that's a hockey fan.
I've enjoyed the hell out of this whole conversation. It's been the most Canadian conversation ever. I want to thank the plumber for not showing up on time.
Yes.
And I appreciate the hell out of you spending time talking about this doc and some of your other projects. It's been a great conversation.
Well, thank you, Ryan. The plumber, I'm sure, will show up at some point. Well, there's a ding on my phone right now. I'm sure he's downstairs with his wrench ready to fix the sink. Thank you for taking the time to sit with me. Thank you, everybody, for listening. The documentary is on Sunday, the 22nd, on CBC, and then Gem thereafter. I am in Florida. I am going down to the beach. So
why wouldn't you?
Why wouldn't I? Thanks very much, my friend.